Welcome to another Bookpotato interview. Today I am with Adam Powell, author, historian, teacher.
Thank you.
Your new book, Soldiering On.
Yes.
What's it about?
It's about basically war veterans, hence the sort of title, of World War One, and how they coped after the conflict.
Sure.
Okay. I thought there's a lot of books, particularly in the last few years because of the centenary, on the actual battles and the soldiers' experience themselves. But there's nothing really about the actual soldiers' experience through the 1920s and 30s. So it's about how they coped, or didn't cope, after the war.
So, life after they come back from the trenches and go back to normality, and you know how they continue with their life.
Yeah, which of course some people couldn't, because it was simply the conflict was so devastating for them.
Of course.
That they simply couldn't fit in to civilian life. I mean, some of them had really never been that much in civilian life because they'd left straight from school.
Yes, they were very, very young.
So their only sort of experience of adulthood had been, when it's stretching it saying adulthood because some were 14, 15, 16 years old when they actually went into the army.
Of course.
They came out and, I mean, they were still by our standards really young. They'd maybe done 4 years of military service and they were only 20, 21, but they were so, I think, scarred for the rest of their lives.
Well, you
by the experience. Yeah.
How did the governments of the time and society of the time deal with the sheer number? Would one be a problem? And then what did it make any accommodating policies towards these huge numbers of people coming back?
Yeah, I think overall we probably have to say they didn't do very well.
Sure.
Though they did try some accommodating policies, but they're really probably not enough. I think one of the problems is actually the sheer scale of numbers.
Yeah.
Britain, unlike some of the other countries, had never had a mass army, at least until since Napoleon. So we had very small armies, a big navy, because obviously they didn't need a big army.
Yeah.
So we didn't have any mechanisms for dealing with soldiers in any numbers coming out of the army in the way the French or the Germans had. That was the first problem. So there wasn't much in the way of mechanism there. But some people, I think, were certainly helped. Some veterans were helped by charity. I mean, there was a mushrooming of huge amounts of charity work because the government was simply unable to cope. So one of the most famous, I guess, is the British Legion work, the Poppy Appeal. But there were lots and lots of others, including just down the road, combat stress for shell shock victims. Okay. So charity work did help, that was undeniable, but I don't think it was quite enough to deal with just the numbers. Like, officially there were 80,000 people suffering from shell shock coming out of the British Army. That was a massive underestimation.
Right.
Lots of people were not diagnosed because, you know, if you diagnose someone, you probably have to treat them and then you take them out of the front and they needed for soldiers. Or they develop symptoms after the conflict.
Yeah, very much post-traumatic.
Absolutely. Or obviously things like people who'd suffered, the amputees, people who'd been blinded. These were just numbers that they just couldn't cope with. So a lot of them sadly ended up on the streets, ended up as beggars. We didn't have, sadly, even though a number of veterans requested this and veterans organisations, we didn't have compulsory hiring of veterans after World War One.
Okay.
And that was a problem. World War II, they'd learnt, and so one of the things they did towards the end of the war was saying that companies of a certain size have to hire veterans. As preference, particularly if they're disabled. That didn't happen after World War I. So a lot of veterans, you know, you go for a job interview, you know, what have you been doing? Well, I've fought in the trench. Have you done anything else? Well, not really. Well, we don't really need you, sorry. You know, we've got plenty of people wanting jobs. There's quite high unemployment in Britain. Throughout the 1920s, and people remember the 30s as being the Great Depression decade, but actually the 20s there was still high unemployment in quite a few areas in the UK. And so soldiers were at the back of the queue.
Right.
So a lot of them couldn't find jobs. Heroes for a while, you know, the land fit for heroes sort of, first few weeks coming back, they were greeted like that. You know, there were sort of street parties thrown for them, and you know, all this sort of stuff. But then very quickly, people forgot.
Yeah, it got boring.
And even soldiers sometimes said that when they came back into civilian life, just people either couldn't comprehend the things they'd seen, or they didn't want to comprehend. So, they would sort of start telling people what they'd seen, and people would sort of shut off or think they're exaggerating or things like that. So I think then they sort of, maybe partly because of the generation they were from, didn't talk about it.
Sure, of course.
Certainly not to people who weren't there. And there were things like, say, the British Legion clubs where people, like-minded people, who'd all been through the similar experiences could meet. But otherwise, I think it's very difficult for a man who'd been seen the things they'd seen to just go back to their family or workmates and talk about what had gone on.
Of course, because it was horrific.
Yeah.
Would you say there was definitely, is it clearer to make that distinction between life before the First World War and British life afterwards?
Yeah.
Was there a massive shift?
I think in many ways it certainly was. I think the war speeded up change, or it created things that were totally new that may never have happened. Obviously we don't know, because it's to some extent sort of counterfactual, because we can speculate, but the 20s was very different than sort of the Edwardian era in lots of respects. I mean, some positive changes from the war, so leaving veterans for a while, things like women's rights were advanced.
Sure.
It was a good thing in terms of the vote, less restricted fashions, things like that. Obviously, women were obviously affected by World War I in the sense they became factory workers, went into offices, and got a measure of freedom. I think just there was a sort of, it's not measurable, but it's certainly, I think, I've read about experience, a lot of veterans came back and certainly felt less intimidated, perhaps less deferential. They thought they'd been through a lot, and some of them did say that despite the horrific experience, the war helped them in certain ways. If you've been through the trenches, if you've survived, perhaps you're going to be civilian life is to some people perhaps relatively easy.
Yeah.
You're faced with challenges. I've had worse challenges than this. Or perhaps, I mean, some people say that they felt young men would have always deferred to their fathers. Going back to a small village, your dad's probably not been more than 30, 40, 50 miles in his life.
Yeah.
You've seen more than perhaps he has in many ways, and you're 21 years old.
And you've travelled overseas.
And there is that sort of, and there was sense, I think, as maybe a sort of palpable sort of change in less deference, perhaps, for those people who'd been there.
Sure.
Perhaps there was less. One of the things that was interesting was that I read was that obviously before World War I, Britain was very much a stratified class system. Classes didn't mix, or when they did, it was from a very sort of artificial way. Okay.
Sure.
The World War I did. Those people shared a common bond from very different social backgrounds, and that was very, very interesting. You might have some sort of 19, 20-year-old lieutenant from perhaps a well-known private school, becoming friends with, because I think there was friendships with his men of this platoon of people who were miners. Now, they would never have met
someone from
in real life.
someone from Scarborough.
Absolutely. And they undeniably, the bonds that were sort of formed, which I think was a compensation for the awful thing that they went through, the bonds that were formed between soldiers. They did say, some soldiers did say, that there were horrible things, there were great things that happened in the war, and so the friendships and bonds that were formed were like nothing they'd ever experienced before or since. And I think that sort of there was at least I think a change in sort of social attitudes of people who'd met for the first time in a way they would never have done.
Yeah, I can understand.
Like the Prime Minister in the 1950s, early 60s, Harold Macmillan, was a war veteran. He was from a very, very upmarket background, ironically from the publisher of this book, the Macmillan family, okay? Right. And he was a very sort of Etonian background, but he led a troop that was from a very, very sort of poor area, and he said that he changed his whole outlook,
right?
Okay, about the class system. And he said that for the rest of his life, like a lot of soldiers, the first thing he asked people of roughly his age was, what did you do in the war? And he divided people not in classes. It was those who fought and those who didn't fight. And he always felt more comfortable with those who fought.
Because they could understand.
Yeah, so there was a new divide in a way, not like what school you'd been to, but what were you doing in the kind of war. So it was that was, I think, is a change. Well, obviously, some of the things that changed, like as we said, sort of medical improvements were accelerated. Some technology obviously improved, like the plane, which had civilian use and things like that, as well as the military technology. So you obviously got some changes like that. Some of the things might have happened anyway, but obviously the speed.
War tends to do that, doesn't it?
Yeah. Like I said, the advancements in surgery.
Sure.
It would have happened at some point, but it wouldn't have happened in the 3 or 4 years. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
How did you approach compiling the information of this book in terms of, because obviously this is you're not just making it up. It's not a work of fiction. So
yeah, a lot of primary source material. I wanted to sort of bring out sort of soldiers' voices. So it's reading about the sort of from interviews. Sometimes things like the Imperial War Museum have a great oral history bank of soldiers who were sort of starting in the 1960s, when they were starting to get older. They started being sort of interviewed.
Yeah,
and that's a great resource there to listen to them about not just their war experiences, but the things afterwards. And again, so I wanted to do a lot of primary sources about soldiers, how they viewed the war, how they coped with after the war. So there's a lot of research involved. Clearly there was some sort of key works in terms of the actual sort of 20s and 30s that I sort of read. A lot of writers also wrote about stuff after the war as well. We sort of like Siegfried Sassoon, we know as a war poet. But he also traces experiences, because he was one of the few that survived in the sort of 1920s and 30s, so that was kind of very interesting. Robert Graves, is sort of the poet as well, a survivor, and they both wrote about their life in the 20s and 30s. Lawrence of Arabia, of course, he was killed a little bit later in a motorbike accident, but their experiences that they wrote were also interesting about how they viewed the peacetime. A lot of them obviously was sort of got initially the sort of the triumph went to disillusionment as we sort of headed towards the 30s. War started to sort of beckon again, and they thought, well, we fought this war. Yeah. That was going to end it. It was going to end the sort of mass conflicts.
Yeah, here we go again.
And we seem to be sort of repeating the same mistakes, if not even more so. And so quite a few veterans felt that they really became disillusioned, not initially the sort of 20s, but they felt, well, at least we've sort of created a better world, seemingly. But when the 30s start moving into World War II and Hitler starts going to power, they start saying, well, wait a minute, was it a waste of time?
Yeah.
But it took us sort of 20 years. And the tone sort of darkens with some of the sort of memoirs. The memoirs immediately in the 20s of war veterans are quite positive.
Okay, really?
The memoirs by the 30s are sort of darker and more pessimistic.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that must be, rather soul-destroying, the fact that they've gone through this sacrifice, and it's a clean slate and a clean piece of paper, but as I said, less than 20 years later, it's happening again. And
sometimes they might be too old. You've got veterans saying, my son was heading off to war in 1939. He was 19 years old or something. We just had our child as soon as I got back from the war. Yeah. Just to sort of send him off to war, sort of when he's 19, 20, 21, sort of the same age I was in 1914, and he said it just seemed like a sort of bitter irony that what have we achieved?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And it's a shame about World War I, because World War II is always viewed as the war that stopped Hitler, so however horrible it was, it did a wonderful thing. Whereas World War I is now sometimes seen as, it was a bit pointless. Yeah. And it's how sometimes it's sort of viewed that way.
But of course, it was actually massively important in terms of the whole map of Europe changed quite dramatically. I mean,
it's controversial, but some things were achieved in World War I that obviously didn't stop World War. But some things were achieved. It changed the map of Europe. Some nations got their independence, who were sort of, the Poles and Czechs and people like that. They would see it as positive.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Depends who you are. I mean, obviously we're still living with some of the negatives, like the whole Middle East, the whole back to Lawrence of Arabia stuff. It's sort of divided up immediately after the war by Britain and France in a way that has really not helped the whole piece. We're still kind of coming to terms with the ISIS and Syria and all that sort of stuff. To some extent, it has its roots in dividing up territory in a sort of way that really didn't suit the populations there. It suited the sort of the colonial powers.
Yeah, absolutely. Focusing back on the book for a second again, how would you say creating a factual book, a non-fiction book, do you have any advice for other people perhaps who've got an idea on non-fiction books? Where to start, how you do it, how not to do it?
Yeah, I've certainly made mistakes. If I could go back again, I wouldn't do. Okay, right. So I did learn a few things in terms of what not to do. I think you probably need to don't jump into the research straight away, but think about a little bit about a sort of a game plan before you really start. Okay. Have a clearer idea of where you want to go. I suppose it's like writing a novel. Do you sort of plan, how much do you plan a novel out? I'm not a novelist. Yes. Do you plan a novel, or do you sort of like jump straight in and hope the novel develops?
There's two schools of thought.
Yeah, there's two schools, but I'm personally for the non-fiction thing. I think there should be a plan there. It's not going to be exactly the same at the end of it, but I think if you've sort of got a direction, whereas I was sort of almost anything to do with the war and the aftermath, I was reading, some of it of course relevant, ultimately a lot of it not. Sure. So I'd say that the first thing would be to try and have a sort of at least a sort of a route map, okay, even you have to deviate. In terms of research, I think in some ways the internet has opened up lots of possibilities.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, there's some very, very good stuff out there. I would, though, I think it'd be worth investing. Don't just rely on Google, but invest in a sort of educational websites like JSTOR or something like that. They really have the cream stuff there.
Okay.
Okay. So and the good stuff from Harvard and Cambridge and Oxford, some really good things. But you know, the good stuff usually isn't free. So don't rely on Google. Pay a subscription. I think they're worth the money ultimately to something like JSTOR. I would say that's very sort of important. I think it's just you'd have to sort of, as a non-fiction person, most of your work should be research. I found the writing was less onerous than the actual finding out.
Because you're placing bits together rather than thinking, what should I conjure up?
I wasn't organised enough. I think that's one thing as well, is that if I planned my chapters earlier and then started actually then putting the things in the chapter, I think that would have been having a sort of a skeleton there earlier on. Rather than it's almost like I have these sort of masses and masses of research. Right, well, how do I sort this out? And that probably wasn't a good idea
I was
as well.
About to ask, do you think you could do too much research?
I think you can. I think there's a point. I was getting to a point a couple of years or so before thinking I was getting overwhelmed.
Yeah, there's just too much to
put down. And it's like, what do you do with it? So I think there's a point there, I suppose, of a judgment saying, okay, I've got a sort of skeleton of it, I've got some research, I'm going to start writing it now. I suppose you can always then, if there's too little, it will become apparent once you start writing it. Say, this chapter, there was a couple of chapters that were a bit underdone, I thought, on here. And I said, I had to go back and do the bit on sort of artists and writers was one which I think I hadn't done enough of. So that was then I have to go back and do bits of that about those sort of artists and writers who'd survived the war. I wanted to have a look at.
So I suppose, it's always easier to edit away than suddenly add more to. Again, I think you probably already touched upon it, but I was going to say, if you could start from scratch again, or if you were to do a second book, is there one particular thing that you would do differently?
Apart from, I say, the sort of better organisation would be one thing. One thing I think probably what I would have done differently would be perhaps to sort of get in touch with some of the people in the field, because in my experience they're usually very helpful. To sort of look at which universities in the UK are specialising in things like this kind of, like the University of Leeds is one thing which does quite a lot of this.
Okay.
Just get in touch and ask. They can only say no. Say, I'm researching a book, it's an area which I know that you're a university particularly specialises in. Have you got any advice? Have you got any sources that maybe I can look at? This sort of stuff like that. And sometimes they do have a library, and they will allow visitors coming in, academics or writers, to say, yes, you can't take anything away, but there's a photocopying machine and that something like that I think is an area to go, because they are the experts in the field. and they can cut out perhaps so much work that you might only discover incrementally.
Yeah.
So
don't be afraid to ask.
Don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah, that's a very good point actually, because I think perhaps unless you're already from a academic background, perhaps you would feel that I can't kind of go into their territories with them.
I think academics generally, though, they've also got their own little sort of projects going on, but they generally have a passion for their subject. When someone else shares a passion, they tend to think, okay, they will happily share.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
How are you finding publishing generally these days and selling books and promotion of books? Do you notice any trends? Is there things that you wish you could do differently, or things were different?
I suppose there's an awful lot of books out there.
Yes,
that's the one thing you notice, isn't it? That
yeah.
I guess self-publishing has become cheaper. The internet has allowed access, so in a way it's very good that people can now get their sort of products, for want of a better word, out there. But it means it's very competitive. Okay, it's how you can get lost in a sort of sea of books, and you're just a little sort of pebble. So I think writers have to be marketeers. They have to be salesmen. They have to be business people, which perhaps sometimes they're not naturally. I'm not naturally a salesperson or someone involved in marketing, but I think you have to be to try to
get people's attention.
To get people's attention. So things like an online presence is something that the Twitters and the Facebooks and all that kind of stuff I think is a necessity. Setting up your own website, things like this, using bookshops like yourself. These sort of things I think are absolutely necessary now.
Yeah, it's very much a must.
Yeah, and I think you were telling me earlier, weren't you, that publishing companies tending not to put as much money in marketing as maybe they did at one time. They are thinking about costs, so you have to do an awful lot yourself.
They seem to do more and more relating or more and more dependent on the author doing the legwork and doing it, and they don't want to pretty much do anything. They don't want to create promotional material. They don't want to contact independent bookshops. It's very much that's what the author is expected to do now. Yes.
So you do sort of have that sort of dual role, or your book just sort of which you obviously you love your book. You bring it out, but you want other people to see it. Yeah. But it can sort of, I think get lost. That once you've sold a few copies to your friends and family, then that's it. You've got to sort of somehow draw to people's attention. Research and writing the book is half the battle. And the rest is selling it, promoting it. Back to First World War. Yeah. For the last question. Yeah. If someone who participated in the First World War could come back and think about what was it all worth now, what do you think they would do? So that's it's a good question, because I think there were the sort of two schools of people, because obviously veterans were around 10 years ago. We still have a few veterans around, and many of them were interviewed, probably starting in the 1990s. That there was this sort of people like Harry Patch and people, these sort of people who got interviewed a lot on television. This is sort of the last of the veterans. Yeah. Generally, they were anti-war in the sense they said that war obviously is a terrible thing, but they were certainly divided into one school saying it was a waste of time, but another school saying actually we were proud of what we did because we felt the cause was a good one. Okay, and obviously saying that things like the trench life and things were terrible and awful military mistakes and many friends were lost. They still think that it was worth it, and they don't want it to be forgotten by the people. And interestingly, I think in the last sort of few years, it's come into the public conscious more. Even before the centenary, before 2014,
yes, I think you're right.
World War I has been. Now it's more. I think it's more commemorated more than it was when I was much younger. Sort of Remembrance Sunday is a bigger event. I remember just reading in the 50s, we think people would be still, sort of very proud, some more people were around. It was sort of hardly hardly commemorated. It was sort of, the silence was not a bigger deal, and it was sort of just a few war veterans up at the cenotaph, and sort of people didn't sometimes even stop during that time. And I think now, surprisingly, a couple of generations on,
it's interesting.
It is interesting, and it's just like the whole thing about World War One. The interest in it has become much bigger.
Because it's so long ago, and I say in the 50s, people they were still around.
Yeah.
And now that they're not, now it's more of almost a quasi-mystical sort of thing.
I think there's part of that. There is that, as you say, sort of quasi-mystical sort of aura about it. I think also things like schools have done a lot to raise awareness of it. I think the schools have, even before the centenary in 2014. Even things I remember, Sebastian Faulks wrote about birdsong, and when he was researching birdsong, and he told people, I'm writing a book on World War One. The reaction was, why are you doing that? It's sort of, that's a bit sort of past, no one's going to be really interested in that, can't you do something else? And then he said by the time it was published, there was a tremendous interest, and in about 5 years he noticed a sort of almost a sea change. And he said some critics were saying, well, he's jumping on the World War One bandwagon.
Right.
He said he had this, and no one was interested when he first started this book. He said he was going to be interested in tunnellers in the sort of trenches, and that was probably, I don't know, when was about 25 years ago. That was probably Birdsong came out. So there has been certainly the veterans who were scared that their sort of sacrifices, particularly of their friends who died, would be forgotten. I think they would be happy with the fact that we don't forget. Whatever our feelings about war, whether it was a right or not, those people did go through an awful lot, and obviously, of course, many of them never came back.
Adam, please just mention the name of the book again.
Right, yes, it's called Soldiering On, British Tommies After the First World War. Okay, it's published by the History Press in Macmillan, and it's available. It's
available in store and other online places, yes, I'm sure as well.
But it's better to go to a bookshop than online.
Of course.
Don't you think so?
Always go to independent bookshops.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.